What's going on, guys? This is Kincade and welcome to episode 4 of the 1998 Yamaha YZ125 build. In episode 3, we got this beautiful engine all finished up and ready to go, and there is still much to be done on the bike. Pretty much the remainder of the bike is up there with a few components sitting in this bin. So in this episode, I'm gonna pull that frame down, which has been hanging on my ceiling for months, pull that subframe down, get them all cleaned up, repainted, and ready to go so that we can put the engine in the chassis. The swing arm is also looking pretty nasty and needs a little bit of love, so we'll get that all cleaned up and hopefully have engine in frame in this episode. Now, to get this frame cleaned up, there's a few different steps, but I will be using this super clean degreaser to get some of the grime off. I've actually been super impressed with this stuff. It's cheap, it works amazingly well, and you can pick it up at pretty much any auto parts store. Alright guys, so this swing arm is pretty much polished up, but this side, the swing arm bearings, were completely filled with dirt and they wouldn't spin. And then I've just been blasting them with contact cleaner and a wipe and just continually getting the dirt out. And now both of them are spinning freely again. I'm going to continue this method until they're spinning totally no problem and all that dirt is out, and then just re-grease them. So when bearings are in this condition, and they haven't completely rotted in there, sometimes the bearings will get corroded or misshapen, but in this case, we've got them moving again, so there's no reason these bearings should have to be replaced. Alright, the motor is in the frame, the swing arm is mounted, as well as the linkage. We have a nice smooth system here. Next steps, we'll be cleaning up this shock and painting the shock spring, and then installing this. We'll get the subframe and airbox all cleaned up, repaint the subframe, get those installed, and then I also want to clean up and paint these triple clamps. We've got the makeshift paint booth set up here in the corner of the garage. It'll work. Alright, the shock spring turned out pretty good thanks to this factory OEM color match PJ1 Yamaha blue. We got the shock body polished up pretty good. we'll get these put back together and get the shock installed on the bike. We have spark. All right, the next step to keep this build moving along is rebuilding this carburetor. It's actually really clean and isn't gonna need much work on that front. We're gonna go ahead and tear it open, replace all of the O-rings, spray it out with some carb cleaner, make sure there's no dirt buildup anywhere in there. As with the KX250 build, Pro X is supporting this build. They make awesome products and I'm stoked to be using their carburetor rebuild kit. One other quick tip I have when rebuilding your carburetor is don't feel obligated to use every piece in the rebuild kit. One piece that I often have realized is not actually worth using is the new float needle. The float needle really only needs to be replaced if the tip is starting to wear down, and usually that's not the case. And if you replace the needle, you'll end up having to adjust the float height a little bit because rarely do the bends of the two needles actually match perfectly. In this case, the needle that was in here was fine, so this is a piece that I'm just gonna save in case this one ever wears out. So guys, this Airbox was looking pretty haggard, but after a lot of work and a little brainstorming, the electric sander with 320 grit sandpaper actually got this cleaned up pretty nicely. I was having trouble with any other tools to get this Airbox cleaned up. It was stained, there was some old glue from graphics, there was a lot of scratches in it, but with some time using 320 grit sandpaper with the electric sander, the Airbox on the visual portions look pretty good at this point. I made a last minute decision to go black on the subframe. I was just staring at the bike here and thinking, man, that might actually look pretty good with the two-tone black clamps, white frame, black subframe. I think it could look pretty sweet. Well, I was about to install the handlebars, but hadn't inspected these that closely. Would you look at that? We have a gnarly bend in these bars. Not sure how obvious it is on camera, but it's very obvious in person. Unfortunately, gonna need to get new bars for this bike. Alright guys, we have the rear caliper cleaned up, the piston and the seals still look pretty good on this, so we're going to go ahead and run it. Brake pads have plenty of life left. The master cylinder, on the other hand, had a lot of nasty corrosion, a lot of dirt inside, so a rebuild of this is going to be very beneficial. Thankfully, we have a Pro X master cylinder rebuild kit that comes with all the goodies I'll need to rebuild this master cylinder back to its working form. Quick update, the YZ125 is coming along nicely. Pretty happy with how it's turning out so far. I did find a lot of small miscellaneous OEM parts missing as I was working on the build. So here's a fresh package from Rocky Mountain full of OEM goodies. I need to get all this stuff sorted out. We got a fresh silencer, fresh pipe, skid plate, handguard. Really excited to get all this put on the bike. So the task at hand for this afternoon is actually going to be getting these forks rebuilt. They both leak very badly, but I have a new seal and bushing kit right here. Alright guys, so we have one fork completely rebuilt, and we have another fork half rebuilt. We have the new bushings and seals installed. Unfortunately, I had some trouble getting this cap off. It was over torqued. I ended up torching the outer fork tube just a little bit. It really didn't take too much, and this didn't get that hot. I was still able to touch it. But when I pulled it off, this rubber stopper completely disintegrated. I don't know if that's a factor of it just being as old as it is, or if the heat negatively affected it. So maybe the torch was not the way to do this. Maybe I should have put the fork back in the triple clamp and then broken it with a breaker bar. But with that said, this is the route I ended up taking. So I cannot get this fork fully reassembled until I order a new one of these. We got the radiators and radiator hoses installed last night. Next up, we're gonna go ahead and throw this fresh FMF exhaust on. This bike actually didn't come with a pipe at all, so I wasn't left much of a choice other than buying a brand new system, but obviously this full FMF is going to be sick. I'm not sure if I've made it clear yet, but I'm gonna be doing this as kind of an off-road build. I have a skid plate for the bike. I've got some of Cherubi's handguards. I have a large tank from IMS that will be going on the bike. And Fastway also sent a kickstand. These are the best kickstands around. I had one on my old KTM, and bar none, they are the best kickstands. They're incredibly solid. The mechanism's awesome. You can always trust your bike on one of these. And they always have a sleek design to retrofit bikes that weren't meant to have kickstands. As you can see here, I'm just going to replace the subframe bolt, replace the chain roller bolts, and this thing will be all dialed in and ready to go. So I have these frame guards from UFO that I think are gonna look really good with the color scheme of this build and also protect the frame. But with this Fastway kickstand, the left side frame guard needed some modification. So it had this little spot that dropped down here and bolted here. But since this sticks out, it doesn't quite work that way anymore. So my method for cutting plastics like this is heating up a razor blade with a torch and then pretty much just melting the cut in. right, I was a little nervous about this and if 3 zip ties could make this thing hold solid enough, but it actually feels really good, really strong. This zip tie I think will be reliable. I'm not sure if in a real riding environment there's enough boot rub that it's gonna end up cutting through this. If it does, I think a vertical zip tie is an option because there'd be a little less rub. But for now, I'm gonna go ahead and run it like this. The frame guard feels solid. I think that modification really doesn't look too bad and it's not super obvious that it wasn't intended to fit like this. So overall, I'm pretty happy with that. And I actually really like the way this looks with the radiator hoses and the blue plastics coming and kind of the two-tone frames. UPS just showed up. We got a fresh set of handlebars that do not have an absurdly horrible bend to them. We got a new idle screw because the one on the Carb is totally stripped out. All right, we got our replacement fork bumper in the mail, so it's time to get the right fork for the YZ finished up. So the plan with these wheels was just going to be clean them up, run them silver. I figured this bike wasn't going to turn into anything too special, being a 98 YZ125. But with how this build is coming together, I started to get really excited and realized this is going to be a pretty sick bike. So I couldn't help myself but to pick up some fresh rims. I got new bearings and seals and new spokes. So it's time to get these things completely torn apart, get those hubs out and all cleaned up, and then get some new wheels laced up. Well, we got the tire off the rear with a little bit of an unconventional method. This tire is so unbelievably hard. It's so old, I could not get a bite under it at all. So I went ahead and just hacksawed through it. I figured if the tire was in this bad a shape, the tube would be too. And I was right. Look at all the rust there. We're not gonna reuse this, so it's no big deal that we cut a hole through it. Even this rim strip, at some point somebody tied it together instead of spending $2 on a new one. All right, we have this rear wheel laced up, looking gorgeous. Needs a little bit of truing work, but unfortunately, with both my Excel spoke torque wrench and my normal spoke wrench, I do not have the right size head for these nipples. The biggest head I have is a 6.8 millimeter, and these are larger. These are Moose Racing chrome-plated spokes. This is the first time I have ran into this issue with all of the wheels I have laced. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to order some additional heads for my spoke wrenches before I can get this thing finalized and trued up. All right, we've got a gorgeous new wheel and we've got a fresh Shinko tire to install onto it. Wow, this thing turned out good. Holy cow, fresh bearings and seals and everything installed as well. The hub polish turned out great. Oh, stoked. All right, so I just mounted the tank onto the bike, and this really made me realize that I can fire this thing up, make sure it runs. Yeah, baby.